Support for Conversations Live comes from the Gertrude J. Sant Endowment, the James H. Olave Family Endowment, and the Sidney and Helen S. Friedman Endowment, and from viewers like you. Thank you.
Good evening, and welcome to Conversations Live, Children's Grief. I'm Carolyn Donaldson. Today is Children's Grief Awareness Day. This entire month, in fact, is Children's Grief Awareness Month. And when we talk about grief, we sometimes forget to consider how children experience grief events. Perhaps we might assume that children experience grief the same way that adults do, or that children are resilient and they can bounce back from grief quickly, or at least more quickly than adults do. So how can we better understand children's grief? Well, tonight, we're going to be looking at this important issue, answering these questions and more, and taking your calls and your questions. Now, to help us do that, we have three guests who are well-versed on these topics. Let's meet them. Vicki J. is CEO of the National Alliance for Grieving Children based in Texas. Her 19-year hospice career included end-of-life community education director role and 10 years as the founder and executive director of Rays of Hope Children's Grief Center, also in Texas. She's recognized for her role in children's advocacy and for her strengths in public speaking and community education around this important mission. Kevin Carter's the clinical director of Uplift Center for Grieving Children in Philadelphia. Kevin's worked in a range of human service and academic institutions across our country as a clinician, administrator, and educator. He's been involved in social work education as a faculty member and primarily as field director for 15 years and currently on the adjunct faculty at LaSalle University. And Melody Ray is the coordinator of Healing Patch Children's Grief Program right here in Blair and Cambria counties, serving our area families. She has experience in drug and alcohol counseling and child welfare, and she's also the author of the book, the children's book, Someone I Love Died from a Drug Overdose. Now, you too can join tonight's conversation. We're on air, both FM and television and online, and our toll-free number in all those cases is 1-800-543-8242. We want to hear from you. If you feel more comfortable, our email address is connect@wpsu.org. So Vicki, Kevin, Melody, thank you so much for joining us remotely and safely tonight, especially after the very long day you had with the outreach to all those communities that you serve on this important day. But to begin, we want to look at a clip from our recent WPSU documentary, Speaking Grief. We hope it'll help frame the discussion about how children grieve and how it can be different from adults. Let's take a look.
Children's grief is not mini adult grief. Kids grieve in spurts, and kids are very physical in their grief. Oftentimes, right after they hear the news, you'll see them go and play, and as adults, we tend to assume, oh, okay, they're okay because they're playing, but that's their language, right?
Parents tend to assume that their child is grieving in the exact same way that they are. But oftentimes, children are grieving in a very different way, and that can look like temper tantrums for younger children. It can look like anxiety or even ADHD. And even if the death occurred years ago, having events or situations that remind the child that the person that they loved is no longer with them can be very triggering and can often produce those kinds of behaviors.
Watch where you put your feet.
This is my sword and this is my...
Very telling and insightful, and we hope to begin that discussion. Again, as we said, it's Children's Grief Awareness Day, and my guests have been busy all day long working in their own communities with outreach and creating what we understand this day to happen because children tend to be invisible regarding grief. So let's begin our conversation with the response to that clip, the mini grief versus adult grief, and what exactly does that mean, and also what you saw and heard today as you were out creating more awareness around children's grief on this important day. So Vicki, let's start with you. what did you see and hear on what happened today in Children's Awareness Day?
Today, and actually this whole month, Carolyn, we have been just working really hard to raise the awareness that children do grieve and they need our support. As was mentioned in the clip, many times we kind of forget about kids. And 1 in 14 kids are going to experience the death of a sibling or a parent before they graduate high school or before the age of 18. And so that means the prevalence is huge across our nation of the number of kids. So this week, this day, this month, we've been really working on having conversations, understanding the need to talk about death, dying, and grief, especially when kids and teens are involved, and to make those conversations more comfortable and, supportive for the kids. So thanks to WPSU for Speaking Grief and for this conversation we're having tonight. It's great.
Thank you. Now, Kevin, we'll move on to you next because in Philadelphia, of course, you deal with all types of grief, and we'll get into some specifics. But what was your day like, and what have you heard from some of the families that you engaged with today?
It's been an exciting and a tough day. I've actually was with some caregivers earlier in the afternoon, and I think one of the things that might be surprising to people is there was a lot of difficulty in those conversations, but a lot of celebration around the fact that they may be struggling, the children may be struggling, but there's some fun times and some happy times. And there's a lot of, I would say, hopefulness and concern about how to do grief during these next couple of days and weeks and months going into the holidays. So I, and I left the conversation a half hour ago, and it was about adults getting together to make sure that we need to do what we need to do for young people to grieve and figuring out how we hear their voices more in that quest.
We'll dive deeper into those subjects. Thank you so much, Kevin. And Melody, your boots on the ground right here in the center and Blair and Cambria County regions with some of your partners that you work with. So what was your day like? I understand you were joined virtually on a number of fronts.
Yeah, I was a part of some grief symposium with family hospice and palliative care. So really presenting to professionals out there working with families and grieving children. And really a theme that came up tonight whenever I was talking with folks was the idea of protecting children and really shying away from difficult conversations in an effort that folks think they're protecting them, but in all reality, they're not allowing the children to be a part of some grieving processes. So it was a really good conversation.
Very important. Thank you. As we begin, and we'll be talking over the next hour with our panelists, we want you to understand that we're trying to continue that conversation and talk about speaking grief as it relates to children and directed at awareness and offering some best practices that we'll talk about with all different types of grief. But we do want to tell you that we want you to keep in mind that we're not tonight counseling folks individually on their cases, although there is help available. And we want to show you those numbers that you can call. Help is available regionally at that 800-CAN-HELP number, nationally, and also through the text line. We'll keep those numbers up. We have those numbers for you. If you want and need help immediately, we ask you to call those numbers. We also want you to know that the folks that we have on the panel tonight are part of this wonderful group that is now part of our Speaking Grief group, and we have resources available both regionally and nationally. These are some of the additional resources and phone numbers for our Healing Patch with Melody Ray at the helm, our Tides, which is a program in Center County, and then as well as nationally, Vicki J's program connects the National Alliance for Grieving Children's Programs at that number and that website. And just to let you know, at WPSU, with our initiative of Speaking Grief, we have all of those resources available at speakinggrief.org. So we'll come back to those screens. We know it's a lot to take in, but right now, we invite you to join the conversation. Again, you see the toll-free number at the bottom of your screen. We'd love to be able to entertain as many calls as we can around this very important topic, or if you feel better, to email us. We'll get those to those as well. I want to start with we talk about many different types of grief, but we're going to have to talk about perhaps the deepest one and the most intense one. And our society has not been very comfortable talking about grief in general, but much more uncomfortable when we talk about it with kids. So grief can encompass many things, but let's take that death-related grief to begin. So what should the first conversation look like when you break the news to a child that someone they know, they love, has just died? Can we take a look? And I don't know, I bring these questions to our panel and ask them to respond and bounce off each other. Who wants to start?
Carolyn, I will always start because I am so passionate about this. And I think that, many times we wait till the big aha moment to sit down and try to tell a child everything. And in reality, kids need to be brought along through the process. So grief starts the minute there is an anticipated loss or change. If you happen to have a warning or be aware that something is going to change, that's the time when you start bringing them in piece by piece by piece. Imagine what a child would feel like if somebody had been ill or in an accident and everybody knew, and then the first they find out is that a death occurred. Mm-hmm. It's a really hard way to start a conversation with the child. So I guess my basic answer is, as soon as possible, bring them in small pieces, kind of always testing where they are, reflecting back to them. Do you understand? Do you have questions? Do you want to know more? So that it's a back and forth conversation. It's not I'm telling you everything I know. I need to know what they need to know or want to know or what they actually do know and think. Mm-hmm. I could keep going, but I'll stop and let somebody else continue on.
Great.
That's great, Vicki. Absolutely. I think too often those conversations start and then kids are steamrolled with all of it all at once. So I think starting from the beginning, if it is a known illness, but of course we also have our sudden losses, unexpected tragedies and accidents that do happen as well. And I agree. I think it's starting with sitting them down and giving them that information in a space of safety and security with people that love them and support them and are factual about how their person died. Kids really need to know the physical reasons why a person died, what made their body stop working. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, with our really young children, working to avoid euphemisms. We see that a lot when families are enrolling and explaining that, grandma's sleeping or that the person passed away. And so they don't understand what death even means. Mm-hmm. So it's starting with their knowledge base on understanding what does death mean and building from there of answering their questions.
Okay. And Kevin, I know that in your practice and in your work at Uplift, you've seen COVID-related deaths, homicide, overdose, suicide, especially in the unbelievable region where you're working and you're doing your best work. Can you tell us specifically, are there any other best practices around those type of sudden and tragic and unimaginable deaths when you're relating it to children in their grieving process?
Yeah, I love what Vicki and Melody led out with, and I try to support that with the notion that goes even further back, and that's about having caregivers and parents know their children, because if you know your child's personality, you know the things that they like and the things that they struggle with. Mm-hmm. When a crisis occurs, you can begin to cater your responses to what you know your child can take. Some of that is developmental. So, let's say you have a 3-year-old and there's a death in the family or there's a death in the circle. Mm-hmm. People will often assume that it doesn't impact the 3-year-old, but that 3-year-old's attachment to the caregivers probably adjusts to the caregiver's energy. So there's that, is that the caregivers around the child need to support them, whatever age they are, but also realize that if the caregiver is stressed, the children are going to pick up on that. So there's some fundamentals that have been mentioned that I think we want to focus on those. And I think to speak specifically to the city of Philadelphia, I think we're in a spot in this moment that we weren't at this time last year in terms of death being so much in the forefront for people. So the irony of this is that there are more opportunities to introduce death and loss and grief and dying to our children. And it gives adults a little more pressure to be able to have answers. And that's why I love some of the information that NAGC is putting out, 3 tip kits on how to talk to children. So I think a lot of this is about adults coming together to figure out how to get the information to people, because when they get it, they really use it well.
Great, and we want to provide that information real quickly. I just want to, for those of you just joining us, and we'll get right back to our panelists and continue the conversation. If you are just joining us on air or online, again, this is Conversations Live, Speaking Grief, and joining us tonight we have Vicki Jay, CEO of the National Alliance for Grieving Children in Texas, Kevin Carter, Clinical Director of Uplift Center for Grieving Children in Philadelphia, and Melody Ray, the coordinator of the Healing Patch in Blair and Cambria counties. We want to hear from you. We've got an email question that I want to get to in just a minute. Also toll free. If you're in the car right now and want to call us, 1-800-543-8242 is the number to call. We're ready to take your calls or connect at wpsu.org. We did have an email call come in, and it ties in with that age-appropriate question, Kevin, that you were going to, and Melody will get to your response here. But Harold from Clearfield writes, how early do kids start to experience real grief? We're talking about making sure we have that conversation, but is it as early as 1 to 2, or is there a particular age where grief can actually start to occur? Can we move in that direction? Who'd like to take that one?
Sure. That's a really great question. From my studies of children's grief, I learned from Dr. Alan Wolfelt that if you're old enough to love, you're old enough to grieve. So even our most youngest grievers, young infants, if it was a primary caregiver that had died, they can feel that, the smells of that person, that routine with that person, and they sense that, and that they deserve to be supported as well. And the ways to do that is through, as much as possible, a predictable routine, more reassurance that their caregivers are going to care for them and love them. So even more hugs and snuggles, and recognizing that you may see some regression with our most youngest children as they don't fully understand all of these difficult feelings that they are having. They are still feeling them, and that we may see it in their behaviors and not their words, as they're not developmentally able to verbalize. But we see it through their actions.
We saw in that clip about, sometimes the manifesting of grief comes through the play as being the language of children. So, how does play factor into grief so that parents and caregivers can see, what the reaction is from children, as you just described, depending on their age?
So the language of children's grief is through play. So children, after hearing really difficult information, they need to take that in doses. We as adults can sit with that information and talk and process. They can only do that in little bite-sized amounts, and then they need to move on being children. A common question I get is, we just told, Tommy, his grandfather or his mother died, and he went out and wanted to play on the swing set. Like, he maybe cried a little, but what's wrong with my kid? Like, why, they expect a certain reaction from the children, and understanding that their grief reactions really may vary.
And I think one of the things that as educators and advocates, we want to name is that grief is natural, and it's normal. And as Melody said, starts early because we have attachment relationships with people. And if those people are not in our space and in our sphere, of course, there's a missing and a longing and emotional and other physical reactions. I think the other part is that when people think about grief, oftentimes they don't think about the body, and how emotions live in the body, and how kids in their natural environment have to work out those feelings that they might not be able to articulate, but they show them through jumping on the swing and playing on the swing, and holding themselves, holding their tummy, or whatever the case may be. So I think what we try to do is to have people think about grief as an embodied experience.
A lot of times people ask, how do kids grieve differently than adults? How does it look different?
Yeah.
And the reality is they do everything different than us. They're not us, they're not adults. So they grieve as kids and they use their natural tools. I love the fact that Kevin used that word. And their natural tools are play and activity, and a way to get those emotions out is not usually words, as Melody said. It's something totally different, where we use our natural tools of talking and conversing. They don't have those tools yet. And I think that if we let kids lead us, we would all be more natural grievers. It's not until we put adult expectations or societal norms on their shoulders that they start to kind of change that naturalness about it.
I understand, too, that sometimes children, again, act because of grief, and they actually can close themselves off or completely shut down. So those are also perhaps behaviors that we as adults need to address when we see that happening in our children?
Carolyn, you asked a while ago, how can you tell on the question about the very young child?
Yes.
And how do we know when a child is grieving, and what do we do when they shut down? And is that a sign? And, we all handle everything differently. And so for a child, there's not a checkbox that you can say, if they're doing this, they're grieving. And we don't really have that assessment tool. But what I would say is, if they're different than they were before, then it's time to check in with them. So it's not just if they were sad or closed down or, inward. It could be just the opposite. They could be overachieving at school, trying to make up for some losses and try to win the attention of the surviving parent or whatever. So for me, the best way to kind of look for that yardstick is, are they different, behaving different, acting different, physically different? Are their sleep patterns different? What is different than was before?
Very good points. How about modeling healthy behavior from the adult side? Are there special or best practices that we can do where we can model what's considered, I guess, a healthy grief awareness behavior for the kids, if you're a caregiver, if you're the parent of that child? Melody, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is, I hear this all the time, that it's okay to show your emotions and cry in front of the children. How else I think it's once again, it comes from a form of protection. We're coming from that we want to shield them. But when we're not modeling healthy grief behavior, which tears are a sign of our grief, and mourning is healthy. And by children seeing the caregivers in their lives expressing their grief in healthy ways, they recognize that it's okay for them to then cry. So by them seeing that, it helps them that we understand that it's an okay thing to talk about, that maybe right now they don't want to talk about it, and that's okay. But by telling them, you can come to me to talk about it. This isn't something that, we don't need to talk about now, but we can talk about it later. Sometimes I hear car rides are the perfect time, or when there's other distractions going on, because if it's just face to face at the kitchen table, most times they do shy away. And second of all, letting them know if they aren't wanting to come to them, that there's other there's other people in their support network, because you do see that most common, especially with our older kids and teens. They a lot of times maybe don't want to go to mom or dad or caregiver that's already burdened with a lot of things going on, and they may go to uncle, or they may go to their coach, or they may come to a grief center, and that's their place to kind of express it. But always knowing that primary caregiver, that it's an okay topic to talk about, and it's an okay thing to share our feelings on.
All right. I also want to repeat again that we want to hear from you. 1-800-543-8242 is the number to call. Please join this conversation. I have questions prepared, but I'd love to hear from our audience, both on air and online. Help us to speak about grief and as it relates to children. And I know I was interrupting Vicki there. She had some comments from, I guess, her national alliance. You see this in action, the way that adults can model behavior and actually provide them with some tools, right, Vicki, through the many support groups that you help coordinate and sponsor.
Absolutely. Kids need support, the bottom line is, but it's not always the parent that is in a position of support. When grief strikes, it often strikes the whole family, and everybody is kind of at a different place at different times. So it's very often important to bring in another neutral party, as was mentioned earlier. And sometimes that is support groups, and we have support groups across the United States, and now a lot of them are virtual, so the arm extends even further. Kevin mentioned resources where they're online, free, downloadable resources. I know we have some on the NAGC website. I know that Speaking Grief and both of these other centers have them. And that they come in to be very helpful when a parent or an adult is trying to support a child at home without reaching out beyond others.
Good. Kevin, can you walk us through a session that might happen with a grief support group that you work with Uplift? How does it look like for families that may want to get involved and are going through this situation right now?
Okay. If it's okay, I'll walk you back a little earlier.
Okay.
Where we get that call from a caregiver and they're telling us why they need support. Perhaps there's been a family member or someone in their close circle or a friend that's died, and we really are trying to establish a rapport with them and someone who will listen, because oftentimes before they get to us, people have not listened, and they've had the inability to kind of hold that space for them. So we try to establish that relationship initially, and then we try to communicate with the caregiver and the child before they come in the group, because we want them to know that there is someone who is not a complete stranger that will be interacting with them. And then when we get into a group process, we have established rituals. For example, we might say our name, the person who died, our favorite snack, or whatever our favorite TV show is. Because what we're trying to do, and I think Melody already referred to this, is we're trying to establish some routine in that group too. Because if when the death catches you unexpected, and I think that's always the case, even though we know someone's sick, we don't want the group to be something that's unexpected. So we have those rituals. We'll have certain kinds of activities that allow them to talk about their life, but also walk into talking about their grief. It might be artwork. It might be just playing a game. As Vicki has already said, there's a lot of good media out here around grief and emotions. So really what we're trying to do is to create opportunities that they can choose to take advantage of. I think one of the things that we're really focused on in the virtual space is trying to create that freedom. So when we have teenagers on the call, if they don't want to be on camera, we don't have them on camera. And we're finding that the participation is still at a high level, because one of the things that I think we all know, people who show up to our groups, they show up to do the work. And that work might look like talking, but it might look like I'll go to 5 groups I won't say one word except for my name is Kevin and who died. But at the end of the group, I'm telling the practitioners and the volunteers and everybody, I want to come back to that group. And, people are often shocked. But I think what we're trying to do is to say, you have control over your thoughts, feelings, your behavior, and we're not here to control you. We're here to allow you to stick your toe in, pull your toe out. And I think the other thing is that they need to see people like them who are going through the grief, because I'm a 50-some-year-old man and a 5-year-old. They might like me, but they're going to like that they see somebody across that screen looking like them. So a lot of this is about bringing people out of isolation for support from people who feel, think, and look like them.
Very good. I know others on our panel want to add to that discussion, but I want to just remind everybody, if you're just joining us, I'm Carolyn Donaldson. This is Conversations Live, Children's Grief on WPSU. And joining us tonight, we have Vicki J., CEO of the National Alliance for Grieving Children, Kevin Carter, Clinical Director of Uplift Center for Grieving Children, and Melody Ray, Coordinator at Healing Patch. We want to hear from you out in the audience. Toll-free number, call us with a question for our panel, 1-800-543-8243. We're ready to take your calls. You can also send us questions by email at connect@wpsu.org. I want to just show, for those watching us and viewing us tonight, another clip from our recent documentary, WPSU's Speaking Grief. And we're going to look at a clip that really deals with children dealing with grief, but children's resiliency, that term resiliency, and is it often misunderstood? Let's take a look and hear from our panel.
A lot of people say that kids are resilient and that they can make it through anything. But I think one of the places where society may need to reconsider their position is just how resilient children really are, and that they can become invisible in all of this.
Oftentimes, we will tell the surviving sibling, you now have to be strong for your parents. You have essentially told them you cannot grieve because your parents need you to be strong for them.
It has been incredibly hard living in the house with my parents as the only kid now. Usually your parents are the people that you can go to, but I feel like I can't because they're going through a tough time.
Tough, resiliency, bucking up. But do we need to validate that grief? And Melody, I'm going to go to you because you were going to join us with some more insight as to the support group efforts that are underway both regionally and across our country. And Melody, again, Director of Healing Patch in Blair and Cambria County. So what is that resiliency factor, and how does it play into the fact, these are kids, right? These are children.
I think one of the biggest indicators on children's resiliency when these terrible things happen and these losses happen is their caregiver response. That's one of the biggest indicators on how resilient a child may be. So if the caregivers are taking care of themselves and they are coping with the loss and finding supports and having outlets where their grief is being acknowledged and validated and that it's an okay thing for them to express, that tends to carry over to the children. And that is one of the biggest factors in the resiliency for the children is their primary caregiver's reaction.
As we've said before, that really it has to be an important part of that best practice. So Vicki, we have a shot of 10 ways to help a grieving child. I'd like to put that up on the screen now. Again, this was taken and culled from information that we have, and maybe you can start the conversation. We look at taking care of yourself. So let's look at some of those. Are these in line with what you guys are doing out there in your practices and in your outreach to your families?
Absolutely. You know, you're first. You can't help somebody until you are healthy yourself. As Melody said, research says the number one indicator is a good grief model for kids. So taking care of yourself, being honest, listening, all the things that we know, acknowledging that kids do grieve and they need our support. You know, I think many times we think they're resilient, that they're not grieving, that they might not need our help because their grief doesn't look like our grief. Mm-hmm. And they're a kid first. A child is a child, a teen is a teen, and on top of that, they're dealing with other losses, and they're not going to quit being a kid. So part of it is letting go of our expectations of what grief looks like and follow their lead and let them tell us what their grief looks like.
And Kevin, you mentioned in your work, you talk about the rituals and types of things. So that can be also duplicated, I guess, at home or in those home environments, right?
Absolutely. That's really what we're trying to do, is to give them expressive opportunities that they can use in the group space, but also in other spaces. We're very careful with that in terms of not insisting that they share with people outside of the group, but letting them and their caregivers know these are the activities that we did tonight. We're going to encourage the children if they feel okay to share it with their caregivers, but if not, that's okay too. You know, we used to, and I'm sure Melly and Vicki have done this too. You do memory boxes, and sometimes we'll talk to caregivers and they have those memory boxes under their bed after 5 or 6 years, and we have a big chuckle because they still don't know what's in them. And part of not knowing is knowing other things, knowing that your child has ways of coping and have avenues of coping that you are privy to some, but not necessarily privy to others. So I think a lot of this work is about helping adults not to be as controlling as it naturally would feel when your child's hurting and when your child's going through difficulty. You might want to barge in a room and say, who are you talking to on the phone? Because you're not talking to me. I mean, that's an example. So really it's a lot about adults taking care of their own grief so that the kids, they're watching and they're picking up on our cues.
Modeling after behavior. Can we move to, again, we've been dealing with a pretty heavy death-related grief, but we're dealing with this global pandemic. We're dealing with COVID right now. We're dealing with many different forms of grief, and children, again, are seeing this play out. We're having, your sessions are being done virtually for a safe environment. Who'd like to start on that conversation about, maybe some specific things that can be done in those family situations dealing with less than death, but still vitally important for those children, right? And this is real stuff they're dealing with in their school and their home environments.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I'm really thinking of safety and security. So with this virus out there, kids really need to be reassured that what are the caregivers and people around them doing to keep them safe? So, and explaining the reasons why we're doing these things to keep you safe. So why we're wearing masks, why we're social distancing. And then another really important aspect of that is allowing them control in that process. So picking out their own mask, having them be, I see this with the younger ones, being the mask police. So as the family's getting ready to leave, they're in charge of, does everybody have their mask? And is everybody's mask covering their nose and mouth? If not, that's their job, that they do that. And so by giving them some safety and security and some control in a very uncontrollable situation for a lot of us, it can really help with ease some of those anxieties in them. as well as keeping our social supports up. So keeping ways to find connection that although they may not be, visiting and seeing their friends, and boy, these kids, they know the technology better than us sometimes. So FaceTiming and online gaming, finding ways for reprieve from this, as well as I really think it's important limiting their exposure to what they're seeing in the media and the amount that they're watching. That's really, really important. So it's important that we're educating them on the pandemic, but limiting how much of some of this stuff that they're watching. But then also going back to just grief in general, acknowledging their losses through this pandemic.
It's
big
real
and small.
Yeah.
So there's people that are losing loved ones to death, but then there's the loss of not seeing their friends at school or missing a graduation. These need to be acknowledged as well.
All right. We do have an email that I'd like to get to. Sarah from State College writes, what is the best way to deal with a child who seems to be in denial over the death of a loved one, where they're still trying to be happy and he or she insists that everything's okay? What is the underlying message behind that? Sarah would like some direction.
I can weigh in on that one.
Kevin?
What I tend to try to say to caregivers is that denial might be a protection that they need. However, the denial that you see is they still have to live in that reality. So they might not be talking about it, but if it's a close person, they're walking by that room. They're missing their presence. And I think a lot of it is about allowing the kid to have their process in their own time, because the overwhelming feelings, the person could again be protecting themselves, but also they might be trying to protect the caregiver because they might not want to have those strong feelings and thoughts. And as Melody and Vicki have said, I think one of the keys here is really trying to find out what kind of supports are available to the young person, and it might not necessarily be you. One of the things that I find with teenagers in particular, there's always this test about whether you're going to be there. So if you say you're going to have group, you need to be there because they need to be able to choose developmentally where they want to be with you or not, because that's part of what you're dealing with as an adolescent. It's closeness to caregivers and distance from caregivers, but also trying to work on your relationships with other people. So I would not press the issue. I would, ask them to consider how to stay where they need to be for the child and allow that child to eventually come around and come to them and remain available.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. We'll get back to more of your questions and calls. Please give us a call if you're just joining us. We've got about 15 minutes left. This is Conversations Live, and it's children's grief that we're talking with here on WPSU. We've got Vicki Jay, CEO of the National Alliance for Grieving Children, Kevin Carter, Clinical Director of Uplift Center for Grieving Children in Philadelphia, and Melody Ray, Coordinator of Healing Patch, serving Blair and Cambria counties. Toll free, 1-800-543-8242, ready to take your calls or connect at wpsu.org. Now, one thing I want to, before we get done with our program, and the time goes by so quickly here, we talk about grieving and speaking grief and getting better at it. And we need to also deal with not only grief unique to each person at different age levels, but also giving supporters some guidance and helping them build some skills. So if we are supporting a grieving family where there may have been an adult or there's also child or children present, how can we show up with for each member of that family? How can we help as the supporters of that grieving family? Do you have some specific ideas or best practices where you can consult again, the helper who's out there trying to do the right thing?
First thing that comes to my mind is, I'm sorry, Vicki. The first thing that comes to my mind is continuing to be present and continuing to show up. So many families that we hear from is, early on, the funeral, the days after, they are encompassed with support. And then as the weeks go by, that trails away. And the people that said, we're here for you, they've kind of moved on and haven't been checking in. So I think it's follow through.
And Vicki?
I was going to say, I think you answered your own question, Carolyn. You show up.
You show up.
You show up, and then you show up again. And it doesn't mean you have to do or say anything. It means that they know that you're there. Whatever that means to the relationship that you have, you're there. You're there today, you're there tomorrow, and you're there on down the road. That's what people tell us over and over and over. They just wanted to know that people were there. They didn't even know what they needed, so they couldn't tell you what they needed. They just needed to know that they were supported. Very similar to our kids. They just need to know they're loved.
Okay. Looking at resources, and we know your National Alliance and your specific programs help. I understand from you as our author of the children's book, Melody, that when you were reaching out and doing some counseling, you're trying to find resources, and that was part of the impetus of even writing your book. Can you share with us a little insight into that, and what resources are out there now that maybe are newer for families and people to come to?
So back in about 2016, the calls, like every other call, was from a substance overdose in our community, and particularly Cambria County. Statistically, we were like one of the second highest of substance overdoses in Pennsylvania. And when I had looked, we have a wonderful lending library. There's lots of wonderful grief resources on talking to children. There was a lot of resources on talking to kids about other stigmatized losses, such as dying by suicide. But there really wasn't much specific to talking to children about substance overdose. And so that's what really prompted me to write the book, is to have another additional resource out there for families, most importantly, to help guide the conversation. So families are really looking for very specific language. So how do I explain substance overdose to a child? Do I lie to them? Do I say the person had a heart attack? Do I not say anything at all? And so what the book was meant to do is to help guide that conversation. And if anything we've learned is children need to know the physical reason someone dies. And so language like your person took too much of a medicine or drug, and that made their body stop working. That's what made your person die. So language along those lines being another resource. And since I had written the book in 2018, there has been much more, a plethora of more resources for children and adults of supporting children and families of this particular type of loss.
And let's look at those resources. And Vicki, I know that you in that national spotlight, looking at the number of things that are available, we've got the toll-free numbers up there right now that if you have immediate need right now, we want you to know there is help available. Tonight's conversation is creating this awareness and continuing the conversation and showing up, as we've talked about, to talk about grief for adults, for children. But again, 1-800-CAN-HELP in Center County. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline is there and available 24/7 for you. Or in today's modern world, the texting crisis line there is another way to help. And then the resources that are available both regionally. Our friend Melody at the Healing Patch had her toll-free number if you're in this region of Cambria or Blair counties. In Center County, the TIDES organization and the tidesprogram.org is a great resource to use. And then beyond that, again, Vicki's program, the National Alliance for Grieving Children, as well as we have tried at WPSU through our documentary and our initiative, Speaking Grief, to kind of curate and call those resources together, and we continue to have those conversations through our website, on our Facebook, and on our social media. But Vicki, I want to look at, again, the national scope, and again, tell us again the numbers that you're working with and the numbers that you've seen out there as we deal with children's grief going into this month-long program of awareness.
We finally have a tool that tells us how many kids across the United States are grieving. And it's CBIM, the Childhood Bereavement Estimation Model. that comes out of the JAG Institute in Colorado tells us that 1 in 14 kids will experience the death of a parent or a sibling before the age of 18. And that number actually doubles before the age of 25 to be 1 in 7.
Wow.
And when you really think about that, in a classroom that maybe is 28 kids, that means 2 of them are going to experience the loss of a sibling, a significant loss of a sibling or a parent before they graduate high school. And, you know, the cost of inaction, of recognizing and doing something about that, affects our nation, across the nation.
Absolutely.
You were talking about resources with Melody. The NAGC is a membership of 1,400 members like Kevin and Melody and their organizations, who come together this month to put together 4 very specific resources about talking with kids. One of them is about death and dying, just having those conversations. One is what we talked about early on, how to tell them that somebody has died. Both Kevin and Melody mentioned the importance of rituals. One of them is explaining rituals and ceremonies to a child. And then the last one that will come out next week is a focus on family. How do we move together and grieve as a family? And the significant thing about these resources is they weren't authored by one person or one opinion or one research. They're put together by people who have credentials and experience in the field, and they are just invaluable and available on our website for use across the nation.
Wonderful, Vicki. Real quickly, I do want to get to our caller. We have a caller, Irene from Punxsutawney. Irene, are you joining us still tonight? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Thank you, Irene. Would you like to pose your question to our panel? Thanks for calling. What would you like to ask, Vicki?
Yes, I can.
Irene?
I want to know, what do you do when you have a 12-year-old who have recently lost his grandfather, his uncle, due to COVID, and also his father present haven't been in his life, and he's been like giving me hard time, school hard time.
Sure.
He's getting bullied, and then, you know, we're African American, and where we at in this small town is they're racist. They calling him the N-word, and he have all this bottled up, and no matter what I try to say to him and what I try to do, he's not getting it.
Oh, Irene.
I just know, what do I supposed to do?
Well, Irene, first of all, we are so sorry for your loss, and thank you for making that call. We've got less than 5 minutes, and so I want to get right to the panel. Who would like to help Irene with perhaps some action?
Yeah, I would say continue to do what you're doing, because you're leaning into your child's struggle and the family struggle. One of the things that you may want to consider is, because where a lot of us are doing virtual work, trying to find a program that you all can get into to find that grief support.
Sure.
Also, you know, if you're going to reach out to therapists in another vein, is really to talk with them about whether they handle racial trauma, because it sounds like your child's dealing with a loss, but he's also dealing with the challenge of people affirming him for who he is. So I would say try to find some grief support virtually. Consider, if it's necessary, a therapist that can speak to his needs. And going back to what Vicki and Melody said, find some support for yourself immediately, because I promise you, based on the work that we do, there's going to be another mother or a father or a grandmother or an aunt and an uncle somewhere in a town near you that can tell you how to navigate this. And then the beauty of it is you can tell them what you tried and what's worked for you.
That's
and then
great.
You all can share the load together.
We're all in this together. Now, we've got less than 2 minutes, so I do want to hear real quickly from Vicki and from Melody here as we close out our show tonight.
Absolutely. Find help for yourself and then help for them. It's And both of these panelists have resources there close by. So connect to them, go online and connect to either one of their centers. If they can't help you, they'll help you find somebody who will.
And Melody.
Exactly that. First of all, my condolences to you on your loss and the struggles that your son is having, even beyond the losses to death. And certainly, we're here for you, our program, or linking you up to another that may be closer to you. The beauty of the virtual world is we've been able to service even more families in this time.
Our panel tonight, we can't thank you enough. This has been a very good, encompassing program about children's grief. Again, in our virtual connectivity, we can connect, and we hope that you've been able to take something away. Our guests tonight have been Vicki Jay, the CEO of the National Alliance for Grieving Children. She's based in Texas, but she's all over the place. Kevin Carter, the clinical director of Uplift Center for Grieving Children in Philadelphia. And Melody Ray, the coordinator of the Healing Patch, which is centered in Blair and Cambria counties, but the outreach is beyond that. So we have those resources available on our website as well through our Speaking Grief. There you have the 800 numbers to call as we close out our program. We thank you for joining us. We thank our panelists, and this on this National Children's Grief Awareness Day. Thank you. Have a very good, thoughtful, and safe night.
Thank you.
Thank you.